Good afternoon and welcome to the NITheCS 7th of July Colloquium. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, who's Timothy Kuiper from Mandela University, previously also including Oxford University and the University of Cape Town. Timothy will be speaking about the combination of nature and also looking visions that influence rhinos. I think it's really going to be a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much for traveling to Stellenbosch. Welcome also to everybody who's online. We appreciate your joining our colloquium this afternoon. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is that a bit too loud? Cool, I think this is working. There we go. Yeah, it's lovely to be here. This is a beautiful city. I've had a lovely bowl of pasta and a glass of wine and some coffee. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to have met some people already that I didn't know before. It's lovely meeting Christian now. Yeah, so thanks for coming along. So I'm going to speak a bit about my research on, broadly speaking, the illegal wildlife trade. So this case study on rhino poaching is just one very small part of a much larger international trade in wildlife. Everything from spiders to plants to fish to eels in Europe, mushrooms, fungi. A lot of wildlife is involved and harvested for consumption in various places. So it's not just the rhinos and elephants being poached in Africa. There's a much big picture. So I also want to acknowledge that this was a collaboration of a lot of different partners. And in fact, this wasn't a project that I initiated. It's a project that was initiated by people on the ground, as it were, at the front line of rhino conservation. Particularly want to highlight Sharon and Stephen. So Sharon is the CEO of the Greater Kruger Environmental Protection Foundation, and Stephen Whitfield is a regional ranger at Kruger National Park. And then that's Kathy Dreyer, the head of the ranger services at Kruger National Park. So it's people like these at the front line of rhino conservation that realized that they were still losing so many rhinos, despite millions of dollars and rands invested in their protection. So they were bold enough to ask the question, why are we still losing so many rhinos? What's going on? Especially with hundreds of tracking dogs and helicopters and fence alarms and cameras with artificial intelligence detecting poachers, hundreds of poachers being arrested, and yet still losing so many rhinos. So they were bold enough to ask why. And then they brought on board academics like me to support them in the role of analyzing the data that they collated from over a 7-year period. And so I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Rez Altweg, UCT. He supervised this work. I did it as part of my postdoc. And then this is Professor Milner Gulland from the University of Oxford, who was my PhD supervisor and who helped with the project as well. And this project's kind of expanded over the years and continued with it during my time as academic at Nelson Mandela University. These are all the reserves that were involved in the study. So I'd like to acknowledge, probably turn my speaker down on my left. Yeah, there we go. Pleseri Reserve, Balule, Sabi-San, Timbabati. These are private reserves next to Kruger National Park. And then a reserve in Mozambique as well, Karangani, and a reserve that's managed by the Mpumalanga Tourism and Parks Agency. So yeah, massive collaboration, lots of partners. Sorry, this clip is a little slow. Um, and this is the study area. So I'm sure many of you, or if not all of you, are familiar with Kruger National Park. It's in the northeast part of the country, and those are the reserves next to Kruger, at which data were collected. So we're really excited. I think I was lucky to be invited to this, probably because of this paper that was published in the journal Science. We were thrilled that it was on the front cover. I really couldn't believe it when I got that message. But then I also laughed because I know a lot of 99.9% of people don't really care about the journal Science. But anyway, we were excited, and the article was picked up by a lot of news agencies, and I think that's where Professor Petruccioni picked it up. So thanks for the invite again. So I want to talk about a related project first. Sorry, the images are not displaying. I don't know what's happened to the presentation. Picture can't be displayed. It's funny, you see it on the left panel there, but not on the. Don't worry, I'm sure I'll figure it out. Not actually. These are. Let me close the presentation and open it. Sorry, everyone. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. Sorry, everyone. I won't be long, hopefully. I have multiple versions of this presentation, so okay, I closed it and opened it again, and now it's working. So give me a second, I'll share my screen again. That looks better. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm going to do a quick sidestep just for 7 minutes or so about a related project, which is related to my PhD at the University of Oxford, and it was in collaboration with the international convention that regulates trade in wildlife, CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, and particularly their program for monitoring elephant poaching. And that's a photo of a ranger that I took during my field work in Zimbabwe. And he's recording data on this very old elephant carcass. Although, to be honest, I think he was more posing for me and my PhD project. We just did a very baby patrol. So I could get a feel for the rangers and the work they do in monitoring elephant poaching. That's what this project was all about. So this data set is quite incredible. They work at over 64 sites now in Africa, and over 10,000 poached elephants were detected in the period of study by rangers on patrol. And because patrol effort varies by site, the number of rangers varies, the number of elephants varies, we can't simply just look at the number of elephant carcasses detected, and that wouldn't be comparable between sites. So they've developed a metric which is imperfect, but it's the proportion of all carcasses detected by rangers, including natural mortalities that were poached. And if we look at the data, we can see, pike levels of up to 1 is very high poaching, and closer to 0 is 0 poaching. And once you get above 0.5, it's estimated to be not sustainable. The elephant populations start declining. So those here and online might want to think of it before I go into the next slides. What might drive poaching? Why might poaching be higher at some sites and in some years compared to other sites and other years? And maybe I'll ask the audience here if they want to shout out any ideas. Why would poaching be higher in some places compared to others? What factors might be involved? Weather. Okay. So how would weather affect it? There, that's a very good point. So it's not just about the poaching process, it's about the process of detecting and monitoring the elephants. And certainly droughts would lead to lots of natural mortalities as well. Any other ideas what might make poaching higher at some sites compared to others? Yes. 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 That's a very, yes. Yes. No, I'll repeat that for those online. The accessibility of the site, the porosity of the system, how easy it is to get in and out again. I'll probably move on now because we did look at both those factors actually. But in other times when giving this particular presentation, I've had people mention factors that we didn't actually look at, which was a problem. We should have thought harder. So what we did was we generated hypotheses first of all, and I think that's a general lesson I've learned about doing good science is before looking at data, generating clearly testable hypotheses about how you think things work out there in the world, and then identifying the kinds of data you would need to test those hypotheses, and then only running statistical models after that. So the thing is, in our field, the data are very sketchy, for lack of a better word, not like in physics, for example, where you're measuring things very exactly and there's not so much observer error. Although I think with quantum physics, that's also the problem, observer bias. But we were very careful to select only those variables that had strong hypotheses and good data sets before we started running these models to avoid false conclusions. So yeah, accessibility was measured. And we actually, there's this incredible data set, travel time data set. It doesn't quite capture all aspects of accessibility, but we used that. Obviously, the smaller a site is, the quicker you can get in and out. So we hypothesized that might play a role. And then we did have, it's not shown in this, I don't think, but we did have rainfall anomalies to pick up droughts, because we hypothesized that that would affect that index pike independently of poaching. So we really do live in the age of big data, and I'm really excited about the data sets that are increasingly available to measure things like socioeconomic well-being. There's this global data lab project that collates data from the United Nations surveys, US8 demographic and health surveys, where individual households are surveyed about their asset ownership and so forth. And from that, we can quantify their wealth status. One of the hypotheses is that in areas where people are poorer, the criminals who drive elephant poaching can operate more easily and recruit people more easily. Another data set was the armed conflict data set. It's quite a depressing data set to look at, because the 30,000 conflict events just in this period of time. And those are ones involving at least one death. So if you look at the Uppsala conflict database, there's incredible information at a fine scale on conflict and who was involved in the conflict, what it was about, how many people died, the date, the time, and it's geo-referenced as well. And so we extracted those armed conflict data to test the hypothesis that armed conflict makes poaching more likely for various reasons. So just for those who are interested in the model we used, obviously it's very large scale data sets, and we had to be really careful about the way we analyze the data. So we used the Bayesian hierarchical model with random effects for the site, the year, country, and the site year. And we also did this thing called regularization, which is quite common in machine learning contexts. It's when you've got lots of variables and you don't want to falsely conclude that they have a positive relationship with your outcome variable just by chance. It's a way of controlling that. So just quickly to the results. Again, none of this was particularly surprising, but in places where households are healthier and wealthier, poaching tends to be lower. In areas where the governance quality is higher, poaching tends to be lower. In other words, more corrupt countries tend to have higher levels of poaching. Obviously, these are very complicated relationships. Law enforcement capacity, the more the law enforcement budget, if it's higher, there's less poaching. Although our study in Kruger kind of questions that and shows that it doesn't apply across the board. And then the price of ivory as well. So I won't go into that now. So our conclusions, we frame them as support for hypotheses. We haven't conclusively proved these hypotheses, but our data are consistent with these hypotheses. So there's really the big message is that poaching is driven by much larger factors beyond the control of the individual site. Corruption, poverty, demand. So it really is a wicked problem that's difficult to address. If you want to read the paper, you can Google that and find out a bit more. And we're also excited that this got some media attention, but this was the worst title ever. What causes elephant? Poor, badly governed people. Just picture people like running around like crazy, out of control, and killing elephants because they're poor. But I think that was missed the point of our study. But anyway. Okay, so back to the rhino impact study. I'm probably speaking a bit too slowly, but this is a picture of a black rhino on Balula Nature Reserve, and the horn has regrown quite a lot since it was dehorned. So the challenge with dehorning rhinos, which is one of the strategies they use, is the horn regrows. And it takes about 2 years for it to reach its full length again. Again, highlighting this rhino project on what we can do to tackle poaching was led by these managers who are doing the things that we are measuring. They're the ones who are training the dogs. They're the ones who are flying the helicopters. They're the ones who are operating the cameras, that sort of thing. And they are the ones who conceived of the project. And I was very lucky to be invited to participate with them in designing the project and then eventually analyzing the results. And they were important both at the beginning and during, but also at the end. When I started producing results, they helped me interpret them correctly. And so we combined, I'll just jump ahead to that because it's the point now, is that we combined the stats. So we combined looking at data, like when they had this many dogs, how much poaching was there compared to when they had less dogs, for example. And we could test these opinions and assumptions of the managers with data. But data is not the final truth, and data itself can be very biased and limited. And so we felt the need to involve, to explicitly use as a data collection method the insights and experiences of managers to help us develop the theories of change for how these interventions work, understand how we were going to measure success of these interventions, and then also to help interpret the results, as I said earlier. So just again, it's these reserves next to Kruger. These are some of the things that were done. And there's just massive complexity because look how big Kruger is compared to the other reserves. So there's a lot more that could be explaining differences in poaching than just whether or not they were dogs or whether they did polygraph testing. That was a funny one. So the context here, again, which I was saying to my colleagues earlier, was that the area surrounding Kruger has been described as a landscape of fear. There's high levels of criminality, high levels of poverty. This is a cash and transit heist. There's been linkages between cash and transit heists and rhino poaching have been shown. Syndicates operate in both spheres. And so all of this will have a massive influence on whether an intervention to try and stop poaching works as expected or not. So, for example, if there's corruption and involvement internally of rangers and managers and others, and again, it's often only a small subset of the rangers. It's not as if all rangers are corrupt, but they can share inside information with these criminal syndicates. And if they're doing that, then it doesn't matter how many dogs or cameras you have. They'll be rendered, ineffective by the reality of corruption. So yeah, this was one of the most controversial ones that the rangers and the managers and people at all levels are polygraph tested. They ask questions about whether they benefit from rhino poaching, that sort of thing. And actually, there's been many staff have been dismissed because of failed polygraph tests. And the thing is, it's not a foolproof method. And if someone is dismissed, they may still remain involved with the criminal syndicates, except now they don't have a job and may even be more motivated. But that's just my opinion. You'll see in the results that we didn't really find anything conclusive about the effectiveness of polygraphing. So these reserves vary widely. You can probably guess which reserve that is with 5,000 rhinos. That's Kruger. And these reserves varied widely in their poaching rates and rhino population sizes. And this was actually the basis of our statistical model. We could really exploit this variation in terms of trying to understand why poaching is higher in some reserves and in some years compared to others. So similar to the elephant poaching study. So again, we were hypothesis based. So we wanted to develop a really clear theory of change or the mechanisms behind the interventions. How do we think they're working? This is actually quite simple in terms of the way we've drawn it up. There's probably a lot more going on here. But for example, these detect and react ones, so the cameras, the tracking dogs, the air support, the idea is that they result in more poachers who come onto the reserve being detected, but also once they're detected, these interventions help to achieve arrests. And the idea is that over time, when people perceive that there's a high probability of being detected and arrested, I'm not going to go and poach on that reserve. That's the hypothesis, at least. And these are the things that might make all of these interventions not work as expected. So in a nutshell, our statistical models were looking at whether the variation in poaching rates had anything to, could be explained by the intervention of particular interventions like cameras, dogs, or dehorning at a particular time in a particular reserve. But it's much more complicated. So there's a lot of other interventions, and there's all these other things happening in the background, like the COVID pandemic and the arrests of high-level criminal syndicates that might influence poaching rates and have nothing to do with these on-site interventions. So it was a very ambitious project, and we're cautious to say that our model was most powerful at picking up the effect of dehorning because it was a simpler intervention. We had a nice mix of sites with and without dehorning, and we had data from before and after dehorning on those sites. So we were able to quite confidently speak about the effectiveness of dehorning. Whereas these other things, you'll see in a moment, we didn't find strong evidence that they reduce poaching. But to be completely transparent, it is possible that they were working, but we just didn't pick it up in our data. I hope that makes sense. So again, this is the model. We again used a hierarchical model and regularization. And these random effects, to try and explain them, they don't perfectly account for these confounders, but they do allow for the baseline rates of poaching to vary between the sites, and it looks for the effects of the other variables over and above these unexplained differences between reserves and over time. So it basically, this model is very conservative in terms of its estimates of effectiveness. So what are the results? We found that we measured the investment in these interventions, and it was enormous over the various sites, and you can see it varied widely by the type of thing. So there was these, specialized underground magnetic cables, for example, implemented in Kruger, apparently with funding from Warren Buffett, but they were very impractical, and they weren't very carefully thought through. The big expenditure item which we included is the expenditure on security staff. So we considered rangers and then the senior anti-poaching leaders as kind of the staff involved in rhino, directly in rhino protection, especially in these 5 years. It was pretty much what they did every day. So we thought that was worth including as an expense item. And you can see that the amount spent per rhino per year is much bigger on the private reserves because they have a lot more finance than on Kruger National Park. So this is the results of the study in a nutshell. Dehorning was found to be the only intervention that achieved a statistically significant reduction in poaching. So it's the one intervention we could say confidently was associated with a large reduction in poaching. Those bars represent the uncertainty in our estimates, and the dots are mean estimates. And basically, if those bars overlap the dotted line, the data are inconclusive as to whether that intervention actually reduced poaching. But by far and away, dehorning was the most effective intervention. We couldn't say for sure, really, that any of the other interventions showed a strong reduction in poaching. Basically, we were measuring at the sites that have more dogs or more rangers or better rhino monitoring compared to the ones that have less of those things. Was there less poaching at those places? And the answer was, you can't really see that in the data. So no, in a sense. So why are these interventions not associated more strongly with poaching? This goes back to our question. Do we focus on enforcement, law enforcement, all of these things? And why are these law enforcement interventions not working as effectively as dehorning? So that's just another way of representing the relationship, that as you dehorn a higher percentage of rhinos, the poaching rate declines. But if you invest more rands per square kilometer in camera equipment designed to detect poachers, the more you spend doesn't necessarily lead to less poaching. So that was an interesting finding. But I think it's because we were measuring these interventions with a very high bar, which was less rhinos poached in the future because you intervened in this way. Whereas these things were doing what they were meant to do. They were detecting lots of poachers. The dogs helped achieve over 700 arrests, for example. So it's not as if they weren't working as they were intended to work. It's just that detecting and arresting lots of poachers did not necessarily lead to a decline in poaching. So I think it leads us to question more generally that approach. And the thing is, that's been shown in other fields of, in criminology, understanding how to tackle crime. Do we just find the bad guys and arrest them? Or do we do something different? So again, the air support led to lots of successful interventions. And again, some of this happened, if we look here particularly, before the rhino was lost. This special radar system, very expensive radar system in Kruger, did detect poachers before rhinos were poached. So on that level, it did prevent rhino poaching. But this one was tricky because only Kruger did it. So we didn't have a site, it wasn't fair to just compare one site with it to all the other ones and say that that's the reason why because Kruger had high poaching despite having this. But it just shows you how complicated it is to attribute changes in poaching to particular interventions. And we'd like to have seen this line being a bit steeper, perhaps, that as you spend more money, there's less poaching. But it was at least a declining line, but it wasn't as steep as perhaps you would expect. So sites that, these are, one reserve, 1 year. This was a smaller subset of the data. That was spending the same amount of money, for example. What's that? I think this might be, what would it be in? I think it's in Rand. So sites that are spending like 20,000 Rand per kilometer, if you look at all their interventions, would have widely variable poaching rates. So basically, the amount of money you spend is not the best predictor of whether you've actually reduced poaching. So it suggests we might be spending money on the wrong things. This is the dehorning results visually. I always enjoy looking at data visually. I love teaching data visualization to my students because I think it's more important in a way than the actual statistical model you do. It helps you understand patterns in your data, helps you interpret your statistical results. And in this case, it was just very simple. Wherever dehorning was implemented, there was a massive reduction in poaching. This is Kruger. And we classified Kruger as partial dehorning because they have so many rhinos, or sadly, they only have around, less than 2,000 now. There used to be 12,000. But yeah, so Kruger's lost a lot of their rhinos, but still, they struggle to dehorn all those rhinos regularly enough. So the fact that poaching didn't decline that much, although we accounted for this, probably just reflects the size of Kruger and the difficulty of keeping rhinos dehorned. So this graph is all thanks to reviewer number 3 on our paper. We were very excited to get into science, but it was like a year-long process of reviews. And this reviewer really liked our paper. The other 2 didn't actually like it, so I don't know how we got in. But he's a very prominent professor at Stanford University and has like 10 science papers. And so I think they trusted his opinion. But he also came on board with us, and he suggested a new way of analyzing the data, which is used in econometrics. So it's a field I'm unfamiliar with. It's this regression discontinuity. Because dehorning was implemented quite abruptly, that allows us to test for an abrupt change in poaching, whereas these other statistical models are looking for an average change. This looks for an abrupt change. And he actually was kind enough to get on a call with me and help me understand how to apply this to our data. And what we saw was quite a marked discontinuity, where on average, before dehorning was implemented, poaching was actually on the rise, whereas afterwards it was drastically reduced and declining. And these asterisks actually represent, although it's after dehorning, those events actually involved some horned rhinos, because when a site dehorns, they get probably about 90% of the rhinos, but some they don't get because it's difficult to track down all the rhinos. And then sometimes, because this is an open system, I should have said that at the beginning, rhinos can move between the reserves. So reserves that didn't do dehorning, rhinos from those reserves can move into reserves that did dehorning and then get poached. So I'll just finish off with some conclusions. So this was helped a lot by having many media interviews and people helping me think through the studies. It's amazing how I began to understand my own research better through talking to people about it. But it's not a magic bullet. So our message is not simply just dehorn rhinos and do nothing else. There was no site that had 0 rangers and 0 dogs. Well, there were a few with 0 dogs, but there weren't this sites with like 0 law enforcement. So we didn't really have a control to say what would happen if there was no law enforcement. And we think the fact that dehorning was so effective might in part be thanks to these other interventions. So broadly speaking, these other interventions increase the risk to the poacher. The dehorning is increasing the reward available to the poacher. But even if you decrease the reward, if there was zero risk, they may still be willing to poach rhinos, because a small amount of horn remains on the rhino once it's dehorned, because it would hurt the animal to cut below that. The horn is made of the same stuff as our fingernails and our hair, but it would damage the animal if it was cut too low down, because that's where all the blood vessels and the nerves, the soft tissue is. So horn is left on the animal, and that is attractive to poachers. Again, poaching still reduced drastically, even though some dehorned rhinos were poached. And this was mostly in Kruger. And the thinking is that the Mozambican criminal syndicates are more willing to take high risks to kill rhino, even though the reward is so far reduced, whereas the syndicates in South Africa, the South African side operating on the private reserves, there's evidence that they shifted their operations to KwaZulu-Natal, where there's another large rhino population, Kluwe Imfolozi Park. So that's another challenge with dehorning. Does it simply divert poaching to other places? And that's a question one of my PhD students now is looking at. Behavioral effects. So just in a quick nutshell, there's been no alarm bells ringing about this dehorning fundamentally altering rhinos' behavior and chances of survival and reproduction, although the studies are still in development and there's only been 5, 6, 7 publications on the behavioral effects. Those publications have shown no or very little effect, except the one study was quite interesting in KwaZulu-Natal, showed that black rhinos really contracted their home ranges after being dehorned. And the thinking is that they were less confident to interact with other rhinos because of lack of a horn. Or maybe the males were feeling embarrassed and didn't want to show themselves to the females. I don't know. I was interviewed on radio once about this, and the guy asked if I knew whether the rhinos felt embarrassed after being dehorned. And I said, maybe, I don't know. Yeah. But we need to address the bigger drivers of poaching. We need to do the hard work of demand reduction, addressing local poverty, addressing corruption, tackling these organized criminal syndicates, things like following the money and so forth. So yeah, this is another wicked problem, and this is it's not a magic bullet. So why did these interventions not work? You've probably picked it up already. I won't spend too much time, but basically, once you detect a poacher, you still have to have the capacity to follow up. So even if you're really detecting a lot of poachers, that doesn't lead to less poaching if you're not following up. And even if you do follow up, there's evidence of many repeat offenders. So people get let out on bail only to poach again. So that's a challenge as well. And these are some of the other reasons why detecting and arresting poachers may not be enough. And yeah, there's lots of potential in reducing rewards. This is known as situational crime prevention. So the criminologists have been talking about this a lot, that if you reduced opportunities to commit a crime, rather than, focus on the person committing the crime and trying to catch them, arrest them, reform them, actually just make crime harder to do, which in this case was done through dehorning. So I asked my co-authors as well for some broader application messages for governments, funders, NGOs working in the rhino space. We mustn't forget that behind all of these interventions are people, and we can't just pump money into fancy technology without ensuring that the workforce is happy, motivated, and cared for. And I was really touched by the stories of these managers and the battle that they've been facing every day, and the kind of psychological turmoil they go through seeing dead rhinos, but also seeing dead people. Seeing a dead poacher suddenly changes your view of how we should tackle poaching, and it's a horrible place to be in. where rangers are losing their lives, poachers are losing their lives, rhinos are being killed. And one of the issues is that, and this is our history in South Africa, conservation has been done really bad in the past. When reserves were established, local people were often forcibly removed from the areas which were now demarcated for hunting under colonialism. And, you know, these reserves were considered the preserve of the privileged. And ever since then, communities have been isolated. Often local people have been isolated from conservation. One of my colleagues at UCT, a criminologist, for her PhD, she interviewed some of these rhino horn kingpin syndicate guys and also local communities. And one of the things someone said was, the rhino has its own doctor, the rhino has its own policeman, the rhino has its own helicopter. Maybe one day when all the rhinos are gone, we will have these things. So it's an issue of social justice as well. And I think the way we've done conservation for decades in this country has missed the point. But that's changing. I mean, I'm definitely not the first person to say this and identify this problem, and excellent work has been done to ensure that conservation is more inclusive and just. Yeah, and there's a great group here at Stellenbosch doing work in that field. Alta's here. She kindly accepted the invite to come and listen, and heard some of her colleagues, Haley and Professor Unsi Biggs, at the Center for Sustainability Transitions, is doing the kind of research that acknowledges the interconnectedness between human well-being and the well-being of the planet. We can't think of them as separate issues. I really hate it when people say, when a poacher is killed, good for them, you know, evil person should just be slaughtered for their crimes. I think that's not the way we're going to solve rhino poaching. Comments like that. Okay, stop in a moment. This is just to say what got me interested in the study and is evaluating impact. So we're very poor at this in conservation science. It's really well developed in medicine. So if you think of a COVID vaccination, those were subjected to rigorous evaluations of effectiveness before they were rolled out. In development, poverty alleviation work and that sort of thing, there's also a lot of randomized control trials and other ways to evaluate impact in those fields. But in conservation, we're very good at measuring the problem, but not at evaluating solutions. So I'm excited about this project because it moves a little bit in that direction, evaluating solutions. Yeah, so that's it. If you want to read the science paper, you can scan that QR code, but I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any. And thanks for sticking it out till the end.
Very much, Tim, for
Okay.
so cogently making us aware of science and societal context. Really.
Yes.
There must be questions from the audience and also from persons online, but let's first of all ask here. Yes.
Thanks, Tim, for nice presentation and very informative. Okay. My question is a bit more technical.
Mm-hmm.
You have used the Bayesian hierarchical models with a quarterly random effect.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, will the result change if you improve the sort of rather having a stochastic rather than considering only a discrete point of randomness in your model?
That's a good question. I don't know. We did test various versions of the model with and without random effects at different levels and with and without this regularization, but I'd never actually thought of including a stochastic component. Again, that's probably the value of something like NITheCS is that we learn about methods that we've never heard of that we could have been using. Yeah, but I'll love to chat more about that. I'll have to have a word with Daniel. Messiah's colleague Daniel was actually a co-author on this paper, Professor Polico, who's a professor here in finance at Stellenbosch. He was one of the co-authors.
Any other questions?
Thanks, Tim. That was great. I have a question about it's very much a not technical question, about the interview or the conversations with the managers,
Yes.
engaging with the managers throughout this process, and just sort of your reflections on how it changed maybe like your hypotheses or your interpretations of the data, sort of where, where those conversations were sort of the most valuable for maybe for you, but also for them.
Yes. No, I'm glad you asked that. There was this one guy, the Stephen, actually, one of the project leaders, who really, really didn't like the result that showed that having more dogs didn't lead to less poaching necessarily. But so there was a big argument between him and the other project leader, and he had a really good point, but we think we also had a really good point. And I'm just saying this because there was disagreement in our team, and not everyone liked the results. And what that led to is, like Sharon said, no, we have to, Sharon, the other project leader, said, Tim, you have to now fly up to Kruger, and we have to have a day-long workshop to flesh out these issues. And that's just one small example, but Stephen was then able to very convincingly explain where he was coming from. And that actually led to us including all those graphs that show how good the dogs were in other things, like they detected lots of poachers and led to lots of arrests. It's just that we didn't find that that was associated with less poaching. Whereas if I had just done this project by myself, I could have just completely eliminated that step and not considered it. But it was also in the stage of, how do we measure this intervention? Is it just the number of dogs, or is it the number of dogs per square kilometer, or is it how well trained the dog has been? And all of that I would never have thought of. And they knew what it was like implementing these interventions. So they were able to give guidance on what we really needed to measure. So it was a profoundly helpful process, and I'm thankful for that. And we kind of met each other in the middle. I kept telling them that they were actually scientists, and the way they were thinking was like scientists. And Stephen, one of my proudest moments in the project was like, Tim, I need to give you a ranger badge because you understand me. So that was cool. It was a really, and it was, sorry, I must just make one point on the leadership of Sharon. So how did we get to a point where I was talking to Stephen and all these managers? And it was because Sharon was the knowledge broker. She was the CEO of this Greater Kruger Environmental Protection Foundation, and she brought us together as managers and scientists, and she trusted me, and she promoted me to them, and I didn't need them to be promoted to me. I trusted them already, but Sharon made this project possible. In many ways, she should have been the lead author. And tragically, Sharon died 5 days before the paper came out, in a very unexpected way. And so, we just want to we have dedicated this whole project to her, because she was a visionary leader, and she got us to work together as a diverse team. And she was the one who said to the managers, look, we need to critically evaluate what you guys are doing. She was the one who encouraged them to ask the difficult questions. And she was just a wonderful person. She treated me so well when I went up there. She was like a mother even. So we were very sad to hear about this. But do check out the Greater Kruger Environmental Protection Foundation website to find out more about what they do. I think they're actually advertising for a new CEO, if you're interested.
Donovan, oh,
It'll be a shorter answer, I promise.
Thank you, Tim, for that very interesting presentation.
Yes.
Two questions. Just wanted to ask two questions. One was going forward, and given that you've done this research with the data, where to next?
Okay.
And the second thing, when you look at the community involvement, it would be very interesting for me to know, for example, there are projects in various communities in the Hoedspruit area, which is close to not only Kruger, but the other private reserves, for example.
Yes.
There's Mike Kendrick encouraging the youth with cameras to go into these reserves to learn about the value of, you know, the wild animals. We look at the arts and craft that the local communities can sell to the tourists, etc. So what else, as citizen scientists, if there's something you suggest we could do or recommend, is there something, you know, not all of us can afford to have a rhino dehorned or donate to that. Is there something that you can share with us?
No, that's a great question. It reminds me of one of the things I said at the end of a blog about the next steps, and one was to keep buying your children pajamas with rhinos on. No, I think just the love that people have for these beautiful animals, and just the interest they show in them, I think is worth celebrating and continuing to do. And that translates into support for conservation initiatives in big and small ways. I think in terms of next steps, we hope that this study, from a scientific perspective, we hope that the study encourages more work like this, where people are critically evaluating what they're doing and measuring and trying to evaluate impact, because we could be investing a lot of money in other things in conservation that seem like they should work. Obviously they work, but do they really work? And we have to be bold enough to ask that question. In terms of, the involvement of just the general public, I think even maybe I might give a quick plug for Save the Rhino International. It's an NGO that hosts webinars and raises funds for projects like this. They're funding me now actually to do a similar project in Tlhotloe. But they're an organization that is very happy to receive even small donations. But I think just visiting parks, enjoying our natural heritage, just by visiting a park and paying your fees, I think that's one thing. But maybe having conversations to speak more kind of philosophically about this problematic narrative about, protecting nature at all costs, and people are bad and we need to. That's the way we solve nature, is just put people in jail, kick them out reserves, control them. That really hasn't worked. So maybe just in conversation with friends and that sort of thing.
Thank you.
We've got quite a number of. Yes, we've got Professor Guy Mitchley with a question. Your mic is open. You can ask your question, please.
Thanks very much. And thanks, Tim, for great talk. Very thought-provoking. Just a couple of points and questions. Firstly, use of lie detectors has been shown to be little better than chance alone. And I'm very surprised to see that they're being used. They are often biased against the innocent. And it feels to me like it's yet another stress on your rangers and staff. So I would, if they haven't been abandoned already, hope that they would be abandoned. But to some other questions, is it possible that the spend on rhino has an effect with the rhino acting as an umbrella species to reduce poaching more broadly? That's one possible issue there. So you're not only saving the rhino through investment, but potentially, stopping poaching on other species. And then if one were to dehorn everywhere, could you kill the market finally and just kill it? Because, I mean, the reality is that with so much value and so much poverty and just poor governance in Mozambique and in South Africa, so much joblessness. The pressure is going to be there for quite a while to come. And it seems to me pretty much as close to a silver bullet as there is, but I'm not sure if that's even feasible. Thanks for listening.
No, thank you. I had to be very careful when doing this project regarding the polygraph testing because I thought it was a bad idea from the moment I heard about it. But I was biased in myself in that I was expressing those views, whereas I was meant to be the independent analyst that didn't have an opinion on any of these interventions. But yeah, I'm with you on it in terms of its the problem. But I think if there's one thing to be said for it, it is trying to address probably what facilitates 95% or 99% of rhino poaching incidents, which is that inside information. Whether or not it does that effectively is another question. In terms of the umbrella effect, I really like that idea, but I was thinking of it in a slightly different way to you, which was that I wondered if poaching of elephants in Kruger was less simply because there's rhinos to poach there. And I had one stage thought it would be an interesting analysis to do, but because per kilogram, rhino horn is, it's widely variable, but let's just say it's around $30,000 per kilogram, whereas ivory per kilogram is just under $1,000 now. So you can get a lot more value from killing a rhino. And then what is the third question about again?
Can you kill the market if you dehorn every horn?
Yes. No, yeah, I've actually been in such a mixed feelings about how to punt dehorning. On one hand, I was just like, flip, if we can do this indefinitely and do it regularly and do it well, we'll save hundreds or thousands of rhinos. But I think the big weak point is just that little stump of horn that remains, that sometimes, because of the shape of the horn, can be up to 20-30% of its weight and is therefore still valuable. But I think in the short to medium term, I hope it's continually funded, because it really is, it has been a game changer and has saved hundreds of rhinos.
Okay, so I'm going to start reading the first. There are some overlap with what we've discussed, but first question from Debbie Jewett. Did you factor in that after poaching, there are less rhinos, so the remaining rhinos are more difficult to find, possibly leading to less poaching? 2, just a comment, in our reserve, we found that dehorning helped initially, but poaching levels increased again after a while.
Yes. So that first point is really important. Less rhinos poached overall simply because there's less rhinos to poach, and we did find that everywhere just about. But what we did was we looked at changes in the poaching rate, so the percentage of the population poached, which accounted for that. And in, I don't know if this person is from Tlhahluwe and Mfolozi Park, but that's a park where dehorning was implemented as well, and led to drastic reductions in poaching, but more recently it's picked up again. There's a combination of factors there. One being, and my PhD student is actually testing this, as more and more populations dehorn, the opportunities to go and shift your operations elsewhere become less and less as a criminal. So you become more willing to poach rhinos with less horn. But the hope is that there's a diversion not just to other rhino populations, but away from rhino poaching as a whole towards, sounds bad, but towards other crimes. So hopefully it just makes this less profitable.
Okay, the next question from Sarah Androcco. What's the best way to get involved to help for those not directly involved in research or on the ground? There's a lot of concern for supporting wildlife conservation organizations that actually end up having a negative impact on rhino or other populations.
Yes, so yeah, you have to be very careful with the causes you support, and don't be tricked by flashy funder reports and so forth. So really investigate the organizations you support. One that I can certainly punt again is Save the Rhino International. But visiting reserves, coming to South Africa as a tourist, enjoying our wildlife is a way you can support conservation. There's a lot of jobs in the wildlife sector.
Okay, was there any impact on the poaching of other species like elephants in the same reserves? Poachers changing their targets since the rhinos were now dehorned or not going to that reserve because less rewards available?
Yes, so that's a very good question, and the short answer is I don't know, but there's strong logic in that hypothesis, so it would be interesting to test it.
Okay, and then Trevor Packer asks, any thoughts on legalizing trade?
Yes, so I'm surprised that hasn't come up yet. And I'll give a very, very short answer because it's a whole nother debate. The argument being that if you legalize trade, you flood the market, you drive down the price, you reduce the incentive to poach. Two big assumptions, well, one massive assumption of that argument is that demand is satiable. So basically there's a set level of demand. If you just boost supply, prices will go down. But there's a lot of evidence across a lot of fields that boosting the supply boosts the demand. So a lot of people who might not have been consuming rhino horn might be interested now. And again, the second factor is suddenly it's now legal. Those who sat on the fence because as to whether to become consumers or not, if they hear now it's perfectly legal, they might be crowded into consumption. That's one of the ways demand might, a legal trade might stimulate more. So you can probably tell my leaning in this debate, but there's a lot more complexity to it. And potentially lots of money could be made by selling rhino horns and then putting it back into conservation.
There's still a few more. Should I do one more and then? Okay. Last one from Annette Hupschler. What additional costs do reserves incur by having to store horns safely, and what will happen to these horns in the long term? Might selling these horns offset dehorning security costs and community benefits?
Oh, so that's great. Annette's the one who did the research that led to that quote about rhinos having their own helicopter and so forth. I hope I got the quote right, Annette. But yeah, just briefly, it's a massive cost and a massive risk to store rhino horns. Suddenly that could become a target. There could be inside information on where that is. People could lose their lives protecting those horns. So the stockpile management, because currently that's what's done to the horns. They're just stored somewhere safely. They're not traded internationally because that's currently illegal. Again, potentially it could be used to offset costs, but I think it's quite a risky enterprise.
Thank you. And I think our time is up. Thank you to everyone who attended online and all of you over here. Thank you also for many questions. Sure, there's much that can still be discussed. So perhaps in the future, there will be more of this. Hope so very much, Tim. And thank you very much for coming and presenting to us on Stellenbosch Day. NITheCS presents our speakers with mathematics.
Fantastic.
Sponsored by. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite all of those who are here to join us for some refreshments. Thank you very much for coming.